keep up with us on green subsidies. We've got Aviator Joe and concerned looking name that world leader for a freebie of some sort in the comments, please. You should know who she is if you're a good global citizen. You might have to look her up. The huge incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, that was the Biden administration's rebranding of various Green New Deal things that they couldn't get through because of Manchin and Sinema, these center-right Dems resistance earlier in the administration, but then inflation, they packaged it up with a bunch of other stuff and they put through 369 billion, I think, of green subsidies. And then Brussels, and when you see Brussels in the paper, that means the EU, right? Because Brussels it's not the capital exactly, but it's where the EU institutions are based in Brussels, Belgium. Has provoked a debate in Brussels about the dynamic between government and industry. And at stake are the very fundamentals of the bloc's economic model. Yes, indeed, because what is the bloc's economic model, the EU? Well, it's very neoliberal, right? It's very not industrial policy. It is hardwired into a lot of these EU treaties that not only, things like deficit, the debt break, debt to GDP ratios, how much deficit they can run, various other things, and of course the independence of the European Central Bank and complete lack of monetary sovereignty, right, for the different member states, and things like, the ECB can't buy member states' debt, although they've kind of bent and broken those rules over the years as the euro crisis happened in the mid-2010s and all that sort of thing. But there's also a bunch of rules in there against subsidies for industry, right? Classic, economic liberalism trying to prevent too much state aid might tilt the playing field, right? Very WTO style type of thing. And the U.S. is party to some of these WTO, World Trade Organization agreements as well that are anti-subsidy. And there was even some talk of the EU maybe suing the US before the WTO tribunal. That has not happened yet because they've sort of hammered things out. And now it looks like at the urging of people in the EU, like name that world leader from France, are urging the EU to actually copy the US, right? And go more industrial policy, more green subsidies. And of course, left Keynesians like me love to see this because that's what we're banging on about all the time is do industrial policy, right? Don't just let the central bank solve all your problems because they're really not set up for that. Okay, they can print money, buy green bonds, de-risk things, whatever, but that's really not enough, right? You've got to mobilize, 10 trillion a year or something into green investment. And as you can see from these figures down here, we're not even close to that. This is global billions of dollars. You can see it if you can see those tiny little figures on the left, right? Renewable power overall, it's gone up from 300 and some $billion a year in 2018 up to now it's maybe 500, but that's still only half a trillion. We need to be putting 10 trillion in, right? And I mean, that's just renewable power, but and so across climate investment, right? We need like 10 trillion a year, but energy efficiency, spending almost as much now on energy efficiency, which is actually great to see. I didn't know that. Grids and storage is big, electric vehicles, nuclear, and low carbon fuels are smaller amounts, but still, we're just put it all together, and you've got land use and agriculture, all these things that you need to spend on. We're nowhere near Paris aligned, right? So I love to see industrial policy happening. I think it's necessary. I'm of that, left Keynesian persuasion. I like Mariana Mazzucato, right? The Entrepreneurial State. I was ranting about that the other day. Great book. Where she talks about how the state is a VC, right? The state is venture capitalist. They should be investing in things, right? Taking risk, doing muscular industrial policy, not just trying to, incentivize private finance to reallocate capital in a rational way because they're not going to do it. So how far toward that sort of left Keynesian vision that people like your teacher have, how far toward that are we going to get through the EU trying to compete with the US on green subsidies just to prevent companies from going here instead of there, right, to get subsidies? This is great. I love seeing, we had the neoliberal race to the bottom of cutting subsidies and, a lot of corporate handouts, but of the wrong sort, right, in terms of tax breaks and things like that. Now we have, targeted corporate handouts to actually incentivize industry to do the right thing, and we might have a race to the top internationally, subsidy competition. Now, of course, you want to be careful because you could distort some things, or there could be some bad knock-on effects. But let's take a look at what some of the concerns are. Why are some people pushing back against, the liberals in the EU are pushing back against somebody like Macron, who was also a liberal, but in the French tradition, he's a little bit more comfortable with a bit of state aid. And so what's really at stake here, if you read the article, is, and I won't read aloud too much of it, but what's really at stake is that Germany is this huge part of the bloc's industry. And there's a long-standing, very unbalanced export-import kind of relationship there. I think that's backwards for you, but if you see that large block here, that's Germany, right? France is next, so they've got their age-old rivalry, right? But Germany is just a huge amount of the state aid currently being dispersed under the temporary COVID crisis framework, right? They put in 356 out of the total of 672 billion euros. I guess that must have been in 2022 or maybe cumulative, not sure. So that's quite a bit of state aid. And the worry is that Germany is already running this huge trade surplus with its European neighbors. This was part of the whole underlying cause of the euro crisis in the mid-2010s, right? You had this very unbalanced relationship where the Germans kind of see their huge trade surpluses as like a sign of virtue and, export competitiveness. But as any kind of vaguely Keynesian commentator is going to point out, right, whether that's, Yanis Varoufakis from Greece, if you read his memoirs, or you read somebody like Adam Tooze on the euro crisis, right, and crashed, that's a problem, right? You don't want Germany to have such a huge trade surplus because their surplus is somebody else's deficit, right? And it actually, so they have all this surplus, and then they have to go and invest that capital somewhere because their domestic demand is weak, right? They have pretty, their people don't spend a lot, high savings rate, just they run a pretty deflationary policy framework at home. Of course, they've got inflation now, but historically they've really kind of held the purse strings kind of tight, and they don't really have a lot of, they don't have a very spendy domestic market, right? So the capital that they're accumulating from all this export surplus, right, has to go somewhere, and they end up, right, their banks end up recycling it into the peripheral countries in speculative real estate investment, right? And that's really what drove the Eurozone crisis, not just Germany, right? But the core countries recycling capital into the periphery, where you get these great rates of return and inflate a real estate bubble, right? Spain, Ireland, Portugal, all these places that blew up. Greece, of course, is the worst one in the mid-2010s. So, those imbalances are long-standing. There's long-standing sort of distrust and rivalry within the Eurozone. France especially does not want Germany to be able to subsidize its industry in such a way that it'll make those industrial imbalances even more so. Okay, so where the pushback, France and its allies are pushing to further loosen the shackles on subsidies as part of an active industrial policy aimed at securing key supply lines. And of course, this is partly geopolitical as well with the whole Ukraine kerfuffle, embedding the drive toward its climate objectives and holding its own in great power competition between the US and China. And of course, the EU always has this weird schizophrenic relationship. How do we, are they non-aligned between the US and China, right? Germany historically has been, Wandel durch Handel, right? Change through trade. Let's hope that Russia and China, if we just trade enough with them, they'll come along, right? They're still kind of clinging to that 2001 China joins the WTO kind of dream that economic liberalization will somehow liberalize these places politically. Obviously, that's not happened. They kind of know that now. But the EU always has this weird position of like, okay, are we attempting to be a great power? Do we do geopolitics? How do we relate to these other geopolitical things around us? And the Ukraine thing has obviously forced that issue. So there's been a lot of shifts on that front. But yeah, so part of this is, holding its own in great power competition between the US and China, which are both cranking out, green investment, right? But economic liberals in countries including Sweden and the Netherlands see a risk that Brussels will, in its rush to compete with the torrent of public cash available in the US and China, end up fragmenting the single market by allowing big member states such as Germany and France even greater latitude to lavish cash on top companies. The IRA, they fear, is fueling a wider push toward a more interventionist, some say protectionist mindset in big economies. And it's not surprising that it's Sweden and the Netherlands that are pushing back here, because Mark Rutte in the Netherlands is a big economic liberal. So yeah, he says the idea of jumping to a sort of race to the bottom on state aid is not to our liking, because of one of the most successful things about the European Union since 1957 is the internal market. And 1957 was when they started the European Coal and Steel Community, which was the precursor to the EU, right? Sort of post-Marshall Plan, just trying to, anyway, we could go into a whole thing on the history of that. It's very interesting, but this is not the place for that. There's questions about how to fund state aid, right? The public finances being strained. Fiscally conservative states are prepared to block any additional common EU borrowing. And that's a long, right, and toxic history in the EU in terms of, and of course they've loosened up on it in COVID, but the ECB wasn't like a normal central bank, and then it didn't issue Euro bonds until like they finally did it like during the pandemic. So it's really weird that you have this common currency, but you don't have like a common safe asset for it. And again, we could go into a whole other live stream about this if people are interested, but there's a lot of screwy things that go along with that. And there were rules in these treaties like against monetizing the central bank buying the debt of member states, which again they've bent and broken over the years. But these are all these concerns, right? These Germanic anti-inflation liberal type of concerns about issuing Euro bonds, common obligations of the Eurozone. These things have not gone away, right? So anyway, so where do they wind this up? They basically say, even the more liberal ones in the flock realize the world has changed, says one senior EU official. On the IRA, the message from Washington is just do the same as us, because we are not going to change anything. And isn't that a nice note to end on? Because yeah, we are not in the neoliberal era anymore, are we? We are in a new world where geopolitical stuff and climate stuff and the poly crisis, as some would have it, is just driving a return to much more state-led kind of economic model and industrial policy. Now, some of us would like to see that go a lot farther, but we are definitely on the way. And just one more way in which the old neoliberal order is falling apart, and some say good riddance to you. But let me know in the comments what you think. Am I an idiot? Am I advocating a slippery slope to tyranny and socialism? Maybe, hopefully not the tyranny part. Hopefully, we get liberal green socialism. But if you loathe that idea, or you love it, or you have other questions or comments, you want to hear more about the weird history or economics behind this or any of my streams, just hit me in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe so I can keep doing these things, and the algo will juice me. All right, great to see you all, and have a good day.